This is the AceMagician AMR5 mini PC. It runs a Ryzen 7 5800U APU and is available in this specific configuration for anywhere between $300 and $400 depending on when and where you buy it. And before I go any further, just check out the kind of performance you can expect from this device. I'm really excited to take a closer look at this gaming focused mini PC. And in this video I'm going to give you both a review of the hardware itself and show you step by step how I turned this into the ultimate Arch Linux minimal gaming PC from start to finish. Let's go ahead and take a look. Hello and welcome to Retro Breeze. You might see the AceMagician line sold under a few different brand names, but this one was supplied to me for a review by Kamrui. As usual, they haven't seen this review before it's gone live, nor have they had any influence over the content of the video, and the Linux installation stuff was completely my idea, and I wanted to handle this video in my way, and this is what you're gonna get. Kamrui have also provided me with a very generous 10% discount code for viewers of my channel, which can make this an incredibly affordable and solid mini PC for the price, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So let's take a look around the mini PC itself. It's packaged in a very high quality way, with lots of foam and lots of protection for the unit. It comes with a big power brick, with a barrel jack connector, and the usual display cables and other accessories, along with the PC itself. As you can see, this has a pretty unique aesthetic, with an upright build and a big power button looming on top like some kind of HAL 9000. The button, as well as the logo on top and the triangular cutouts on each side, illuminate with RGB lighting. And I like the way this has a kind of fade up effect. It's very different looking than most mini PCs that tend to have a cubular box design. But I dig the killer robot vibes of this PC personally. I think it looks great. On the front you'll find a 3.5mm audio jack, two USB 3.0 ports, and a handy Type-C port as well. And this Type-C port is fully capable of power delivery and video out, which means if you have a compatible monitor, you can both power it and send the video signal through this one port, which is awesome. On the back there's two USB ports, a display port, HDMI, Ethernet, and a barrel jack connector for power. Overall the design is pretty good, but there are two elements of it that I don't like so much. Firstly is the power jack connector. I've just kind of gotten used to USB-C everywhere and I'd much prefer to see it here. But it's no big deal because once this is plugged in, it's just going to stay plugged in anyway. The second thing that I think is missing is an SD card reader. Now, an SD card reader isn't a huge deal, but as I've been messing with EmuDeck and emulators and ROMs, it would have been really helpful in this case, but it's not a big deal. The defining feature of the AMR5 is the dial built into the power button. By twisting this button to the left or the right, you get three different modes of power. Performance for when you need it, auto if you don't really care, and quiet when you want to lower the power consumption and fan noise for lighter tasks. Turning the dial changes the color of it as well. And I think this is a pretty cool feature. Personally, I would probably just leave this on performance mode all the time and let my operating system handle the power requirements. But I know a lot of people are energy conscious these days, so if you want a quieter PC that uses less power, you can do it here. One last very welcome feature of this build is that the right side panel will pull off, revealing upgradable RAM and an M.2 solid state drive. In fact, there's space for a second M.2 drive here as well. And by the way, while I'm here, notice that the RAM is Lexar brand, which is pretty respectable, and not some cheap no-name brand. And when you're done being hypnotized by the LEDs on the bottom, the side panel just pops back into place with a slide clip and magnets. By the way, here's the spec list for this PC in particular, because it is available in a few different configurations. This one here has the AMD Ryzen 7 5800U processor, which is built on AMD's Zen 3 architecture, and has 8 cores and 16 threads. It has a base clock of 2.3 GHz and tops out at 4.4 GHz. It comes with 16 GB of dual-channel DDR4 RAM, a 512 GB SSD, Bluetooth 5.2 on board, Wi-Fi 6 on board, and it supports dual 4K monitors at 60Hz or triple monitors at 1080-60. And you can do this via the HDMI, DisplayPort, and/or Type-C connection. And finally, this PC comes with a fully licensed legit copy of Windows 11 Pro. Not that I care about that particular point myself. So without further ado, let's boot this thing up and take a quick look. In Windows, I just tried out a couple of little games, and I was actually blown away by the performance of the 5800U chip here. I don't have a lot of brand new AAA games, but I was able to play Forza Horizon 4 at a rock solid 60 FPS at low settings and 1080p. It ran great, but it also looked pretty good too. I also enjoyed some bot matches in Killzone for PS2 at 1080p with no issues whatsoever. And yeah, just at a baseline, everything seems to be really performant here. And it also stays pretty cool and pretty quiet. Now this is a PC, so when I say it's pretty quiet, I'm not saying it's silent. And in fact, once you get going with something pretty heavy, the fans do ramp on and you can hear them audibly. But it's much quieter than my desktop PC is anyway, so I have no issues with it. Now I did have a problem on the Windows side of things. Well, okay, I have a lot of problems on the Windows side of things, but one real problem I had was that I wasn't able to use Windows Update to update after a certain point. It would just get stuck on this one security update, and no matter what I did, no matter what I tried, I wasn't able to resolve it. Now I probably could have reinstalled Windows and maybe that would have fixed it, but this is just Windows being Windows as far as I'm concerned, and I'm going to erase it anyway, so I just moved on. And speaking of moving on, it's time to transform this bloated, clunky Windows experience into something much more interesting. And by the time that we're done, we're going to have a full Linux-based gaming system built from the ground up using Arch Linux. Unlike other Linux operating systems that come in an all-in-one package, Arch Linux is ultra minimal, requiring the user to start with quite literally a blank slate and build it from the ground up, installing every piece of software they want from scratch, including a desktop, firewalls, drivers, and whatever else. It's highly customizable by its very nature, and it gives you the most ultra fine-tuned experience you could possibly ask for, with quite literally no bloatware or software you don't want under the hood. It has no telemetry, no advertisements. Seriously, why anybody would accept ads in their OS is beyond me. And it is super fast with a tiny footprint. Arch Linux is what the Steam Deck's operating system is built from. And so basically anything that works on the Steam Deck should work perfectly on our Arch installation as well. Does all of that sound a bit intimidating? Well good, because actually it's not that difficult to get started with Arch Linux. Or at least it's much easier than it used to be in the past. And that's thanks to a new way to configure and install it in about 20 minutes. And most of that time is waiting for the installation to complete anyway. However, I want to show you that all this is worth it and the whole thing's not just going to explode when we try it. So for now, I'm going to show you the performance that I got out of my Arch Linux installation on the Kamrui AceMagician AMR5 mini PC with its Ryzen 7 5800U APU. And I think you'll be pleasantly surprised with the results. So let's go ahead and take a look. Of course I want to start out with some PC gaming. Now admittedly I don't own a lot of AAA PC games. In fact this game, Armored Core 6 The Fires of Rubicon, is the only AAA game I've bought in maybe 15 years. But as you can hopefully see, this game runs really well on the AMR5. Now of course we have to remember that this is a mini PC and there's no graphics card on here. But with this game set to 720p and medium quality, it looks pretty great and it runs solid, locked at 30 frames a second. If you unlock that frame rate, you might reach somewhere around 40 occasionally, but it's a smoother experience to just set it at 30 and let it go. And I'm really impressed to see such a new game running on this older hardware so well. Another AC I have to try is Ace Combat, Skies Unknown, and with this game set to 720p and medium settings, I got a rock solid 60 frames a second without a single drop. I went to the penultimate level, which has a ton of things going on and aircraft flying around, and I didn't experience a single frame rate drop. And at medium settings this game still looks phenomenal. It may not be the newest, but the next game I have to try is Forza Horizon 4. With the graphics settings set to 1080p medium, I get mostly 60 frames a second, but it does fairly regularly stutter down to 40 or 50. However, if I lower this to low settings, I get a complete 60 FPS lock. And to me at least, it doesn't look all that different. In fact, I think low settings still looks absolutely fantastic. Next up with Tekken 7, I tried a few different settings. Starting with 1600 by 900 on low settings with 100% resolution scale. With this I got a mostly solid 60 frames a second, but there were some drops depending on which stage and which characters were on screen. But if I lowered the resolution to 720p, and put medium settings with 100% resolution scale, I found that I got an almost completely locked 60 FPS. This is one of those weird games where it either looks fantastic or really bad. For example, here it looks really good, but then you see Noctis and his hair, and yeah, I don't really know what's going on. Next up, I tried a game that I haven't ever played before, called Titanfall 2. This was on sale a couple of weeks ago for $2 or $3, so I just snapped it up. And with this game I played at 1080p with high settings, and I got a nearly constant 60 FPS with barely any drops at all. And it looks absolutely fantastic. And the last game I'm going to try out here is Sonic Frontiers. This game really isn't optimized well on PC at all. However, dropping all of the settings down to the absolute minimum and disabling any kind of anti-aliasing, the game runs at a fairly solid 30 frames a second. And despite having to drop literally every setting down to the minimum, this game still runs pretty well and looks great too. Alright, so now let's check out some emulation. And Dreamcast, PSP, Saturn, N64, PS1 and anything below all of those is a complete shoo-in on this device. I'm not even going to show it to you because it all just runs absolutely perfect, even with full upscaling to 1080p. So let's take a quick look at GameCube, and here's F-Zero GX. And with the resolution set to 1080p, F-Zero GX runs at 60 frames a second without a single drop. It is incredibly smooth, it looks fantastic, and the 5800U has chops to spare even with a game like this. Next up I tried Shadow the Hedgehog. Shadow is a game that typically has a lot of slowdown on the first level, but other than the stutter right at the start, this seems to run completely perfectly as well. And the last GameCube game I tried was Super Smash Bros. Melee, and other than me being a Fox main and self-destructing all the time, this game runs flawlessly as well without a single drop from 60 frames a second. So I think with all this you can say that GameCube is pretty much covered with this PC. So let's take a quick look at PlayStation 2. Here's Dirge of Cerberus Final Fantasy VII, and at 1080p this game runs almost completely solid at 60 frames a second. This game nearly always slows down on weaker hardware whenever fire is on screen, but as you can see there's no problem with this game whatsoever. When I got to a big central area in the end of the first level where you fight a helicopter, there is a little bit of slowdown which I think is related to the moon texture, but it's just a tiny bit and the game is still perfectly playable outside of that. And I was really impressed with this performance right off the bat. And next I have Gran Turismo 4. This game runs a solid 60 frames a second at 1080p. Both my Mango HUD overlay and the PCSX2 overlay itself were claiming a solid 60, but to me it felt just a little bit stuttery. I think it's something to do with the game or the way that it emulates, it just felt a little bit sluggish. But it was reporting full speed, so I'm guessing it was actually running full speed. Next up is Virtua Fighter 4, and it's a really underrated series in my opinion. Every entry in the Virtua Fighter series has been pretty much perfect, and yet it really never had the legs of other franchises. Anyway, this game also runs at 60 frames a second, absolutely perfect at 1080p, and it still looks great today. And finally, I couldn't leave PlayStation 2 without checking out Ratchet & Clank. And here's another game that runs absolutely perfectly, 60 frames a second, not a single dip in any scenario even when everything's exploding, and there's physics going on. So overall you can colour me incredibly impressed with PlayStation 2 performance, and I would say that basically every single game is going to run perfectly on this device. So now let's move up a level to PlayStation 3. And the first game I tried, which I always try, is PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale. If we're talking about underrated fighting games, I think this probably takes the crown. At 1080p this game hovers around 53 FPS, but there are some drops here and there, again depending on which level you're on and which characters are on screen. But overall it works really good. And if you want a perfect 60 FPS experience, you can lower the resolution to 720p and you'll get just that. And this game has a kind of blurry look, and so lowering the resolution doesn't make much of a difference visually. Next I tried out Resistance 2, and this is the first game that I tried that didn't really seem to run very well. It's locked at 30 FPS in the first place, but it drops to sub 20 in any busy scene. And if you drop the resolution to 720p or lower, the performance doesn't seem to get substantially better either. It's just a generally sluggish experience. Next up I tried Infamous, which runs around 30 FPS again at 720p, and it does generally slow down a bit when there are a lot of enemies on screen. But I would say that you can still run around the city and fry stuff with electricity and it's still perfectly fun. I was definitely impressed by this performance in this game in particular, even though it's not quite perfect. And the last PlayStation 3 game I tried was Ratchet & Clank Future: A Crack in Time. This game runs around 20 to 30 FPS when it's set to 480p, which isn't ideal, but upping the resolution to 720p doesn't really help either. It's generally a little bit sluggish and just out of reach for this processor. But now let's switch gears and take a look at the Wii U, starting with Super Smash Bros. For Wii U. This game runs generally locked to 60 frames a second when you run it at 1080p. There are a few very small stutters when you get into really busy levels, but other than that I would say this is basically a perfect experience. And you can have a 4-player brawl with no issues whatsoever. The next Wii U game I tried was Pokken Tournament, and this is a game that runs at 1080p 60 frames a second without a single drop. Admittedly though, I have no idea how to play this game. The last game we'll check out on Wii U is Xenoblade Chronicles X. This game has a 60 FPS hack, and if you switch that on you'll run at an almost solid 50 FPS. It does however drop down to 40 something in busier scenes. However, if you turn off the 60 FPS hack, it will be locked at 30 and it will run absolutely perfect. I really wasn't expecting this good performance from Wii U. and I'm pleasantly surprised. PlayStation Vita is up next with Freedom Wars. This game runs locked at 30 frames a second, but you can even upscale it to 1080p and it will run absolutely perfectly. I had no idea that PS Vita emulation had come so far, and Freedom Wars is one of those games that once you've played it, you kind of know how to play it and that knowledge never leaves you. And now I kind of want to get into this game again. It's just a shame that the post-game is basically a bunch of extremely difficult RNG and save scumming. Another amazing PS Vita exclusive is Soul Sacrifice Delta, and it runs absolutely amazing on this PC as well. Again, we're locked at 30 frames a second, but everything looks incredible at 1080p. And the last PS Vita game I tried briefly was Tales of Hearts R, and once again this seems to be a completely perfect experience. So yeah, for what compatibility there is with Vita emulation right now, it seems to run perfectly on hardware like this. Before I move on to Nintendo's hybrid handheld, I'll talk a little bit about original Xbox. I usually don't dabble in Xbox emulation because it just doesn't seem to be that great to me, but I was able to get the Xbox exclusive Jet Set Radio Future running at 1080p at 60 frames a second, and it mostly stays at 60 except for when you boost, or when you're in an incredibly busy area moving quickly. But for the most part I would say this is perfectly playable. And then I tried Halo 2, and this game doesn't run particularly well, although I'm guessing this comes down entirely to emulation and not the performance of this PC. At the Xbox's native resolution, this game runs at 30 frames per second, but it drops consistently to 20 and below in busier scenes. So it's not particularly playable in my opinion, but I think this is just the way that this game is on this emulator right now. So finally, let's take a look at Nintendo's hybrid handheld. Firstly, Mario Odyssey. With the emulator set to handheld mode, it will hover around 40 to 60 frames a second. If you get into an enclosed space, the game will run really consistently at 60 frames a second, but when you get into wider open areas it can drop down to around 40. And the problem is that this game actually runs slower if the frame rate is lower, so often you'll feel like the game is running in slow motion. But despite that, I mean there's a lot of this game that's playable here, and in general terms I think this performance is really impressive. And the second game I tried was The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. And in handheld mode this game runs at 30 frames a second, but then the second that anything happens, like there's an enemy on screen or anything else going on, it will drop to around 24 or lower. So, you know, I can't really say this runs any worse than it did on the original hardware. Overall, I think that the 5800U processor in the AMR5 mini PC is seriously good. For PC gaming, you can either go back a couple of years and get excellent performance and visuals, or you can play more modern games with lower settings and resolution. But either way, I didn't find anything at all that was completely unplayable. And in terms of emulation, this device has the chops to emulate pretty much everything through PlayStation 2 and GameCube at 1080p with no issues whatsoever. And when it comes to higher systems, well, the Wii U seems to be basically perfect. PlayStation Vita also seems to be perfect, and you can even get respectable performance in a handful of PlayStation 3 games as well. I think that for the price and what you get with this mini PC, the performance is absolutely fantastic, and I really couldn't ask for more for around $300 to $400. As somebody who owns a desktop PC that's nearly a decade old, I'm finding it really difficult to upgrade my PC instead of just buying a mini PC like this. I really think it is that good. And as I said previously, everything that you've just seen in this showcase was running from Arch Linux, either through Steam with the Proton compatibility layer, or emulators installed with EmuDeck. So now that you've seen what all this is capable of, let's go ahead and install Arch Linux on this PC. Now I'm not going to approach this so much as a tutorial, as it is a demonstration and a general walkthrough. I'm going to explain as much as I can along the way, but feel free to ask me in the comment box below if you're interested in learning more or have any questions. The first thing I need to do is to download the Arch installation ISO, and then use a program like Rufus to flash it to a USB stick. Then I'm going to insert that USB stick into the PC, and boot it up to the BIOS by tapping the delete key as the computer boots. Now from the boot override section, I'll select the UEFI USB partition. On the next screen I'll select Arch Linux Install Medium. And after just a little bit of loading, we're going to get to a scary looking terminal screen. But don't worry, it's not going to hurt you. We're now in Arch Linux, booted from the USB stick. Yes, this is Arch Linux. It is this minimal at first. The first thing I need to do here is connect to Wi-Fi because I'm not using the onboard Ethernet in this case. So I'm going to type IWCTL, which is a command line program for connecting to wireless networks. Then I'm going to type station, WLAN 0, connect, and then the name of my Wi-Fi connection. Then I'll be prompted to enter the password. As long as there are no error messages, I'm going to type exit, and then I'll type ping google.com. This ping command is just going to double check that my connection is active, and as long as I get a response I can hit Ctrl-C to stop it and carry on. Now I'm going to type arch install. This is the automatic installer for Arch Linux that I mentioned earlier. And this is basically a step-by-step guide for installing Arch and all the needed software, including a desktop environment. And all I really need to do to install Arch is to go through each of these options and make sure they're set up how I want them. First, I'll go to locales and set my locale to ENGB. Next, I'll go into disk configuration, and I'll say yes to use a best effort default partition layout. Then I'm going to select my internal SSD drive, and on the next screen I'm going to choose the ext4 file system. It'll then ask me if I want to use a separate partition for home. Most Linux users will say yes to this, but I find it a little simpler and less drama to deal with by just saying no. Then I'll confirm and exit. I can encrypt the device with a password if I want to, and then I'm going to go to bootloader, and under bootloader I'm going to select grub. The bootloader is a small program that helps Linux boot, and it will show for just a few seconds before it then goes into the operating system. If you dual boot operating systems, it's a bit more relevant, but it's not too important for this video. And I find grub a little easier to work with than the other options. Next, I'm going to set the host name, which is the name of the PC. Then I'll set a root password and make sure that I remember it. And by the way, I'm setting weak passwords, but if you're doing this, you need to make sure you set strong passwords. Then I'll go to user account and add user. I'm going to set up a username and a password, and when prompted if I want it to be a super user, I'm going to say yes. And this will basically allow my user to run administrative tasks as they would be called in Windows. Then I'll hit confirm and exit. Next I'll go into profile, and then profile again, and then desktop. And this is where I'm choosing which desktop environment I want. There are many different options available, but I'm going to go for KDE. KDE is very familiar if you're coming from Windows, and it's also the same desktop environment that the Steam Deck uses. Under graphics driver, I'm going to go to AMD ATI open source. And then I'll go down to audio. Now I need to explain something about this whole process for this step. There are 3 different components at play here. The Arch installation script itself that we're using now, the Arch Linux operating system itself, and the Linux kernel. And all 3 of those are being changed and updated all the time. And sometimes that can cause some issues and conflicts. And right now, as I'm making this video, there's a bug where if you select an audio server here, the installation will fail. So I'm just going to leave it out for now. What I would typically do is install the audio server after I've installed everything else. But in this case, for whatever reason, audio worked perfectly anyway, so I'm just going to skip this one. Under kernel, I'm going to select Linux Zen. Now, in my opinion, there is really not a huge difference between the mainline Linux kernel and Linux Zen. And in fact, I'm not going to lie, I don't really know what the difference is, to be honest. The only thing I do know is that Linux Zen supports AMD FreeSync. I don't even know if this computer or whatever supports that, but I'm just going to go with Linux Zen anyway. Typically, you might get a little bit of better performance on the desktop itself with Linux Zen, but I've never noticed it. But whatever, we'll just go with this. And now we'll go to Additional. And in this box, I'm going to put any additional software that I want to be installed as Arch Linux gets installed. Personally, I keep this as minimal as I can and do most of my installations when I get to the desktop. But technically, you could put as many programs as you want in here. But I'm just going to add 4 packages. Git, Firefox, UFW, Steam, and lib32 font config. UFW is just a basic firewall, and lib32 font config is sometimes needed for Steam and some games to display text properly in Linux. And these 4 softwares will be available to me as soon as I log in for the first time. Awesome. Under network, I'm going to choose Use Network Manager. And this will let me configure my network on the desktop itself rather than having to use the terminal again. Next, I'm going to set the time zone to my time zone. And then in optional repositories, I'm going to select Multilib. This is just needed to install Steam. So that's all the options done, but none of this has been set in stone yet, so if there's anything I've done wrong or I want to go back and change, I can do it now. If I hit install, I'll be given a summary of the changes that are going to be made. And then after hitting install again, I have 5 seconds to abort before my SSD drive is totally wiped. And now we just need to simply let this run and do its thing. And then after a few minutes when the installation is complete, I'll be prompted to enter CRUT to do post-installation configuration. I'm just going to say no, and then I'll simply type shutdown now, and the computer will power off. Now all I need to do is whip out the USB stick and reboot the PC, and we'll be greeted by this very friendly login screen, which is much less scary than the black terminal we got last time, isn't it? I'll log in with the user I created during the installation, and I'll be taken to the KDE Plasma desktop. As you can see, this is very familiar to Windows, with a start menu on the bottom left, known as the application launcher, a taskbar at the bottom, known as the panel, and various icons that I can do stuff with, like connecting to a network, adjusting volume and stuff in the bottom right. In the application launcher, I can choose or search for software to launch. And most of the configuration you're going to do is through the System Settings application. And one thing that I just love about KDE is how much customization you have available. You can change themes, icon packs, how the login screen looks, how the mouse and gamepads perform, and all sorts like that. There's so much available, so be sure to take a look around if you're doing this for yourself. Now at this point I actually plugged in an Ethernet cable so that I wouldn't have to deal with Wi-Fi. But if I did want to connect to Wi-Fi, I can do it either through system settings or by using the icon on the panel. But at this point, I'm going to go ahead and open the terminal, which is called console. And yes, we are going to have to use the terminal for installing software on Arch Linux. But don't worry, it's super easy to do. One huge misconception that you may have that I want you to challenge right now is that using the terminal is not the same as coding. The terminal is a command line, and that means that on a basic level, instead of going and clicking on something, you're going to type it instead. And a great first example here is to make sure Arch Linux and all of our installed software is up to date. Think about how you might do that on Windows. You might go into Settings, then Windows Update. You might click on Check for Updates, click Install Updates, Reboot or something like that. And then if you have any software installed on your PC, you might need to browse to their websites, download the installer, etc. But in Arch Linux, I'm just going to type sudo pacman-syuu. I'll be prompted for my password and I'll just hit enter. And since we've just installed Arch, everything should already be up to date. But if not, I'll just say yes to installing it all. Now let me explain exactly what we just did. Sudo, which is probably pronounced sudo, stands for super do. It basically means to run the following command as a super user or administrator as it would be called in Windows. Pacman is the package manager. It lets you install software from a repository, remove it, or do other tasks. And the last part, -syuu, are the options that I'm giving the pacman command. So here's a breakdown of all of those. -S stands for sync. It will download and install software if it's not present, or update it if it is present. Y refreshes the package databases, and ensures that you have the most current package information. You can think of this kind of like checking for updates. U tells pacman to update all out-of-date software to their latest versions. And adding a second U performs a full system upgrade if there's one available, and brings your entire system completely up to date. So when you run sudo pacman-syuu, you're just telling your computer to refresh all software databases, upgrade all installed software to the latest versions, and handle any major updates too. That's one line of text, and your password, and your entire computer and all installed software is going to be brought up to date. There's no need to go through any menus, there's no need to browse to any software websites, it will just do it all through this one command. It's super intuitive and easy to use. All you need to do is remember the command. So anyway, we are going to stick with the terminal for a while. First and foremost, let's enable a firewall. And to do that, I'll type sudo ufw enable. This will ensure the firewall is started and enabled every time we log in. Now we'll enable Bluetooth because it's usually not enabled by default in Arch Linux. I'm going to type sudo systemctl enable Bluetooth and sudo systemctl start Bluetooth. Systemctl is the task manager on Linux, kind of like the one that comes up with Ctrl-Alt-Delete on Windows. With this command, using enable ensures that the Bluetooth service will start whenever the computer is booted, and the start command enables it right now without any need to reboot. And just runs one command and then subsequently the next. And to be perfectly honest, we're about ready to game at this point. That's it for the basic setup. I'll just open Steam and sign in, then I'll go into Settings, Compatibility, enable Steam Play for all other titles, and then restart Steam. This will make sure that Steam will use Steam Compatibility, aka Proton, for all of my games. Now I'll just install a small game just to make sure it's all working. And as you can see, this is running great. However, before we do try anything, I want to go ahead and install a few drivers. On some PC systems, you could probably just go on from this point and start playing a bunch of games, but it's still best to install some drivers and stuff before you continue. The following command is going to install a bunch of 64-bit and 32-bit drivers and libraries that various Steam games and other graphical software like emulators may need to use. And in my opinion, it's best to just install them right away. In the terminal, I'm going to type sudo pacman-s vulkan-radeon, vulkan-icd-loader, glu, mesa, mesa-vdpau, lib32-vulkan-radeon, lib32-vulkan-icd-loader, lib32-glu, lib32-mesa, lib32-mesa-vdpau. I'll enter my password if prompted, and then agree to install. If any of these are already installed, they're going to get updated, and if they're not installed, they will be now. And there's one last thing we need to do, which is to install AMD's own Vulkan driver. To do this, I'm going to type sudo pacman-s amdvlk. Now some PC systems might not need this driver, but in the case of this mini PC, if I was playing any kind of Vulkan game which includes all Steam games, the entire system would crash at around 70% GPU usage. But simply installing the AMD VLK driver resolved that crash. And at this point, if all I wanted to do was play some Steam games, I'm completely golden. Everything is done and most games will work perfectly just as it is now. And in my opinion, that really wasn't too difficult. All we did was use a guided setup to install Arch, then we enabled the firewall on Bluetooth, and then we just installed graphics drivers, which if you think about it is pretty much what you'd do with any PC, we just did it in a slightly different way. And once you know some basic commands in the terminal like installing software, things become really convenient and easy to set up on Linux. Whew, so that's the basic Arch Linux installation covered. Grab any refills on your drinks and snacks before we continue, and also please consider leaving a like on this video, and subscribing to my channel for more great content on gaming, tech, and retro handhelds. This video has been a blast to make, so if you're enjoying it, please do consider supporting the channel. I'd greatly appreciate it. Now let's get on to some further configuration. First of all, I want to install Proton Up, which will let me install Proton GE and other versions of Proton for increased compatibility. In case you don't know, Proton is a compatibility layer that Steam uses on Linux to run Windows games. To do this, I'm going to need to enable the Arch user repository, also known as the AUR or the OR. The OR is a software repository that contains a lot more software than just Pac-Man has by itself, and oftentimes it's open source software. And you can usually find anything under the sun on the OR. Stuff like emulators, video editing software, and all that kind of thing is available. Anyway, to access the OR, I'm going to need to use a software called Yay, and I'm going to use the following command: sudo pacman-s --needed base-devil and git clone https://or.archlinux.org/yay.git and cd yay and make package-si. This might seem super complicated, but I'm literally just pasting this from the Yay GitHub page. All this will do is install the needed dependencies, clone the Yay repository, and then build the software. And once that's done, Yay is ready to use. And it works similarly to Pacman, except that you don't need to use sudo in front of it. One big difference installing software from the OR is that it generally takes a bit longer, because software from the OR will typically be built or compiled on your computer directly. But don't worry about that too much. To install the Proton Up Qt software, which is a graphical interface for Proton Up, I'm going to type yay-s protonup-qt, and then I'll just press enter through all the prompts. Now I can find Proton Up in the KDE application launcher, aka the start menu, and install new versions of Proton from there. After doing so, I can enable them in Steam by going into either the game or the system's compatibility settings. Next, I'm going to install 3 more great softwares: Mango HUD, which is a performance overlay that shows stats like FPS, temps, and more; VK Basalt, which is a post-processing layer for Vulkan, enables you to enhance Vulkan-based graphics or use reshade-like filters, and this works on all Steam games. And then G Overlay, which is a really amazing user interface that ties up the previous two and lets you configure them visually. And for all 3 of these, I'm going to use the Git versions. And that basically means that these are going to be the most up-to-date possible versions pulled directly from GitHub. So I'm going to type yay-s mangohud-git, vkbasalt-git, and goverlay-git. And I'll just press enter through any prompts, and all 3 of those are going to be installed. I can now go to goverlay from the KDE applications menu, and I can set up my overlay with Mango HUD and my post-processing effects with VK Basalt. I can hit save, or I can even enable them both globally if I want to. That means they'll run on any Vulkan-based software that's running. And you get a nice little preview of all of this as well. And so that about covers the advanced Steam section for this video. Now it's time to install a bunch of emulators and games directly to Steam with EmuDeck. That's right, you don't need a Steam Deck for EmuDeck to work. So now I'll browse to emudeck.com and download the installer. Then I'll put it on the desktop. I'll double click it and I'll confirm to execute it when prompted. From here, I'm going to click on easy mode just for time's sake, and then when prompted, I'm going to select a custom directory because I want to use my own folder. I have a folder called emu on my desktop which I'll use. I would really like to use an SD card for this, but since the AMR5 doesn't have an SD slot, I guess I'll just go with this. When prompted for my device type, I'm just going to click on Steam Deck. The installer here will take some time, but once it's done, I'll click on Add Games, and then I'll skip to the next page. I'm going to be copying my games from the network myself. I'll open my emu folder from earlier, and there's going to be a new folder in there now called Emulation. Here I can add my ROMs to the correct ROM folders and my BIOS to my BIOS folders. I have a network share for my ROMs, so I'm going to browse there and just drag them over to the folders that I want. And by the way, one great feature of the KDE File Explorer is that you can set up a split screen view or multiple tabs, which makes copying files from one place to the other a breeze. So when I have everything copied over, I'm going to go back into EmuDeck and I'm going to select BIOS Checker. And this is going to make sure that all the BIOS that I have are in place. It looks good to me, so I'll continue. I'm going to go into quick settings and just configure some aspect ratios and basic options. And then I'll click on Steam ROM Manager. It will prompt me to close Steam and I'll just say yes. The parser screen lets me select which games I want to show up in the list. The toggles for Emulation Station and emulators will add an individual entry into the Steam library for Emulation Station and each individual emulator respectively. I will keep Emulation Station active because I do like to be able to jump into that interface when I want to, but I'll disable emulators because I don't want the emulator software itself showing up in Steam. Other than that, I'll just go down the list and check every system I want. All of the games for each system that I check will be added to the Steam library. Sometimes I like to have my bigger 3D modern games in the library, stuff like GameCube and PS2, and just use Emulation Station for lower end stuff, but we'll just go for this for now. Clicking preview will let me see what the library will look like in Steam, and this is looking good for me, so I'm going to click Save to Steam. I'll close the ROM Manager and EmuDeck and relaunch Steam. Then by going into Library and Collections, I can see that my games show up in this list and can be launched directly. And I love how they're divided into platforms, and the icons for each section is made up of the games I actually added to the library. Also, box art and stuff like that is synced automatically too. It's a really amazing setup. And well, that about wraps up this video. Yeah, this was a huge video in the end, but I'm really happy that I made it the way that I did. The AceMagician AMR5 mini PC from Kamrui is a really excellent computer. And I really love these mini PCs for being so tinkerable and easy to use. And as you can see, in just a few minutes we took this mini PC from a standard Windows experience to a fully featured and yet lean Arch Linux installation with all of my Steam games and all of my emulated games too. And the Ryzen 5800U processor in here may be a couple of years old, but it still has power to spare. Sure, with brand new AAA games you need to lower down your settings, but anything from 2 to 3 years ago is going to run absolutely perfect. And for PlayStation 2 and GameCube emulation as well, we're looking at some really excellent performance. To be honest, I wasn't expecting 1080p output from most PS2 games, so I'm absolutely amazed to see it here. I think that the AMR5 has a bunch of really user-friendly features, like the power toggle on top and the USB-C video output, as well as the upgradable RAM and SSD drive. And overall, I think when it really comes down to it, I have absolutely no complaints about this device at all. I think it's an excellent mini PC in its own right. I think it's a perfect tinkerer's device, and I think it has plenty of power under the hood to take care of your daily tasks and your general gaming needs as well. If you're interested in picking up the Kamrui AceMagician AMR5 PC for yourself, in this particular configuration with the 5800U, Kamrui has shared a very generous 10% off discount code for viewers of my channel. I've left that in the description box below along with an Amazon link. It is an affiliate link, so I may get a small kickback at no cost to you if you do make a purchase. And with that coupon code, this becomes incredibly good value for what you get, in my opinion. I had no idea that you can buy a mini PC for around 300 bucks, and it would be this good. It really is shocking to me. And by the way, this mini PC tends to go on sale like every few weeks or every month or something, so you might be able to get it even cheaper if it's not on sale at the time you're watching this video, so definitely keep an eye on it. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any further questions regarding the Arch Linux installation or the mini PC itself or anything else, please let me know in the comment box below. Also let me know if you have a mini PC like this. Personally, I'm seriously considering replacing my full desktop with a PC like this. I'm really coming close to the time that I'm going to have to rebuild my PC from scratch, but I don't really see the point when I can just get something tiny like this. And in most normal usage, it's just as performant as my decade-old PC is anyway. I've also heard rumors that you're able to hook an external graphics card up to this, and that's definitely something I'm going to be looking into as well. Anyway, that's it for this one, finally. So thank you very much for watching Retro Breeze, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.